Scottish history reimagined.
In part 1 of our series, we established the existence of the Magna Via Quadrigarum Abbattis, the Great Carriage Road of the Abbot, and the transport role it played in medieval Scotland. We discussed its significance as mentioned in the Fulch Charter, how Edward I of England may have wanted to guard its eastern approach to Stirling, and questioned whether Edward II would have ignored such a significant road during the Bannockburn campaign. In part 2, we looked at the logistics of the English army as it left the Larbert and Falkirk area. What were its constituent parts? How did it move and how long it took to cover the ground? We discussed what routes it may have taken as it approached Stirling and established what time it arrived on the outskirts of Stirling. So now we pick up the trail as the English approach Bannockburn, and the scene is set for the opening moves of the battle to be played out. We will briefly cover the battle, but focus primarily on the movement of the English troops and baggage train. We will look at what the contemporary chronicles have to say and discuss the probable course of events as the battle unfolded. So let's head up to the Milton ford, where the English would have approached on day 1 of the battle, and take up the story from there. Let's go and have a look. Until this point, the English army had enjoyed relatively unrestricted freedom of movement. The road network leading from Falkirk towards Stirling offered several viable routes. The southern approach through the Torwood led to the crossing at Milton before continuing to St Ninians and Stirling Castle. Was this the route both the vanguard and the baggage train took? Alternatively, by leaving the Torwood near Falkirk and proceeding in a northwesterly direction, an army could travel via Plean to the ancient ford at the site of the present-day Spittal Bridge, before again continuing to St Ninians and Stirling Castle or down onto the Carse. Is it possible the baggage train split, with that part of the leading nobles taking the Milton route, following in the footsteps of the king and the rank and file taking the Plean route, with the intention of always camping on the Carse? Plentiful supplies of accessible fresh water is key to any camp. It's worthy of consideration. As the English vanguard approached the Bannockburn crossing, the contemporary chronicles describe Bruce's right flank as being protected by low-lying marshland, effectively preventing any English attempt to outflank his position. This topographical detail strongly suggests that the English vanguard approached by way of the Milton crossing, behind me here, intending to continue through St Ninians before advancing towards Stirling Castle. By early afternoon on the 23rd of June, the leading divisions of the English army were entering the landscape that King Robert the Bruce had spent days preparing. Without realising it, the English army was being channelled into exactly the type of terrain Bruce wanted. The battle had not yet begun. No sword had been raised, no spear lowered, yet it seems geography had already taken sides. Battles are frequently decided long before the opposing armies come within sight of one another. The choice of ground, the movement of supplies, the direction of approach, and the freedom or restriction of manoeuvre all shape the outcome before the first blow is struck. In the summer of 1314, Robert Bruce understood this better than any commander in Scotland. He did not need to take the full force of Edward II's army head on. He needed only to force it to fight on ground where its greatest strengths became liabilities. Edward II commanded one of the largest armies ever assembled by an English king for service in Scotland. But Bruce intended to make that size work against him. An army that doubles in size does not simply double its fighting power. It more than doubles its logistical difficulties. This is a truth as old as warfare itself. Alexander the Great, Julius Caesar, Napoleon Bonaparte, and the commanders of the Second World War all understood that the larger an army becomes, the more dependent it grows upon the roads, bridges and supply routes. Robert the Bruce may or may not have read the writings of the Roman military theorist Vegetus, yet his actions suggest he instinctively understood the same principle. He had absolutely no intention of fighting Edward on the open ground, where the English heavy cavalry, combined with the archers, had the advantage. For the first day of the battle, the new park south of Stirling provided exactly the conditions he sought. To modern visitors, visualising it without the modern day houses, it appears little more than gently rising farmland and woodland. In 1314 it was very different. The park contained areas of marsh and dense woodland, interspersed with clearings. To the north and east lay the low-lying Carse and the winding channels of the River Forth, and to the southwest the ground rose towards the Gillies Hill escarpment. From south to north ran the Bannockburn, deeply cut in places and difficult to cross, except at known and established fords, and there were only a handful. Bruce did not need to create obstacles, although he certainly did. Nature had already provided them. His task was simply to exploit them. So what about the pits? One of the best known features of Bruce's preparations was the digging of concealed pits. Barber describes them vividly. Each was dug deep enough to cripple a charging horse, then covered with brushwood and turf until almost invisible. Modern historians have debated their exact location and effectiveness. Some question whether they played a decisive role. Others regard them as an important psychological as well as physical barrier. Whatever their precise contribution, the principle behind them is unmistakable. Bruce was narrowing Edward's options. He was not attempting to stop the English cavalry everywhere. He was forcing it towards the few routes still open. Again, the theme of the campaign returns: movement. Then we have the Schilterans reimagined. Perhaps Bruce's greatest innovation lay in the way he intended to use the Scottish Schilterans. The Schilteran was not new. Scottish armies had employed dense formations of spearmen before, most famously at Stirling Bridge and at Falkirk in 1298, where Edward I's archers and cavalry had shattered them. But Bruce had learned from that defeat. His Schilterans would not stand immobile awaiting attack as Wallace did at Falkirk. They would advance. Barber compares them to great hedgehogs bristling with spears. To an English knight, the effect must have been deeply unsettling. The very arm upon which the English military confidence rested, the mounted charge, was about to meet an obstacle it could neither easily penetrate nor ride around. Again, the landscape mattered. On open ground, cavalry might simply outflank the spearmen. However, within the restricted approaches to the new park on the first day, such manoeuvres became vastly more difficult. Bruce had transformed geography into a weapon. As Edward's leading divisions emerged from the roads leading to the north from Falkirk, the contrast between the two commanders became increasingly apparent. Edward was still thinking in terms of relieving Stirling Castle. Bruce was thinking about controlling the approaches. The English army continued to advance from the south towards the main way and the crossing at Milton here, which led to the new park, through the new park. Now, did Edward intend to take his baggage train over the Milton crossing here? He had expected a swift victory and certainly not a two-day battle. What were his thoughts? Its columns stretched for miles. The baggage train remained somewhere to the rear. Livestock, carts and wagons still occupied the same roads that the fighting men had used only hours before. But now we have a battlefield taking shape. As the afternoon of the 23rd of June advanced, the two armies finally approached one another. The campaign had reached its decisive moment. Edward's army had completed its march. Bruce had completed his preparations. The landscape had channeled one army into precisely the ground the other had chosen. Only one question remained: who would strike first? The answer would come before the day was over. Not in the great battle remembered by history, but in a dramatic encounter between the Scottish king carrying his trusty axe and an English knight who tried to ride him down. Which brings us to the encounter. Among the countless episodes associated with Bannockburn, none has become more famous than the meeting between Robert the Bruce and Sir Henry de Bohun. Barber's account has entered the Scottish national memory. Bruce, mounted on a palfrey and carrying only an axe, rides forward to inspect his line. De Bohun, having crossed the ford at Milton, recognises him. Lowering his lance, English knight charges, but watching armies pause. Bruce waits until the last possible instant. Then at the very moment of impact, he turns his horse aside, brings his axe crashing down on de Bohun's helmet, splitting both helmet and skull. The English knight falls dead. Bruce's axe shaft breaks beneath the force of the blow. It's a magnificent story. Whether every detail occurred exactly as Barber describes it is impossible to determine. Yet even if later tradition has polished the narrative, there is no reason to doubt the essence of the encounter. What concerns us here is not merely the duel itself, but what it reveals. Bruce was close enough to the English advance to observe it personally. The armies had already come into direct contact. The English cavalry, well ahead of the main body of their foot soldiers, and in particular their archers, had engaged the Scots formations in the new part. The battle had begun, not as one great collision, but as a series of probing movements along restricted approaches. Which brings us to Clifford's Ride. So let's move from the Milton Ford here and head down to where Clifford and his cavalry may have crossed the Bannockburn. Join me as we head down to what I'm going to call the Orchard Ford. So we've come from Milton Ford down onto the Carse, into an area, you see the Bannockburn behind me here, into an area where it's probable that Clifford and Beaumont crossed the Bannockburn to try and outflank Bruce. The area I know as Orchard Ford, others will know as Thunder Ford because there's a railway bridge just behind us here, and you may hear from time to time the trains crossing it. But here we are in the vicinity where, as I say, Clifford and Beaumont crossed the Bannockburn to try and outflank Bruce. So while the duel with Bruce and de Bohun attracted later chroniclers, another engagement may have carried greater military significance. English knights Sir Robert Clifford and Sir Henry de Beaumont attempted to lead several hundred cavalry around the Scottish left flank to outflank them. If successful, they might cut off their expected retreat or relieve the garrison without fighting a major battle. However, Bruce anticipated the move. He detached a schiltron under Thomas Randolph, Earl of Moray, to intercept him. The resulting clash demonstrated something entirely new. The Scottish schiltron did not remain static. It manoeuvred, it advanced to block the route, to engage the enemy, and the English cavalry found itself unable to break Randolph's men. Beaumont later remarked that Randolph's men had formed up like hedgehogs, preventing an impenetrable wall of spear points. The comparison is revealing. Randolph did not chase, he manoeuvred, took position and denied the English approach. He pressed on. Exactly the same might be said of Bruce's entire strategy. He was not pursuing Edward on day one of the battle. He was preventing him from moving where he wished. As the hot summer day wears on with numerous clashes, and as the afternoon eased into evening on the 23rd of June, neither army had yet committed itself fully. The English had suffered, from their point of view, unexpected defeats which damaged the morale of the rank and file. The Scots had gained much confidence. Yet the greatest consequence of the day's events was less obvious. Edward had failed to force a passage through the new park. His army remained concentrated within the restricted ground of Stirling, and behind it stretched miles of road occupied by baggage, livestock and transport. Ahead stood Bruce's prepared positions. The next day there would be no easy manoeuvre around the Scottish line. The roads were too crowded, the ground too confined for the large numbers of English, and the time too short for the English to reorganise. The initiative had passed. It now belonged to Bruce. So where did the baggage train go? Well, once again we turn to the contemporary chroniclers for clues. John Barber tells us, and I quote, "Meantime their king, Edward II, resolved in council not to fight, unless compelled ere morning light. So therefore they bivouacked that night down in the carse, and ready made that they might, when morning came, be well in order for war's game. And as the carse was swampy ground, they took from all the houses round rafters across the pools to lay. And from the castle, as men say, seeing their army's sorry plight, there came beneath the shade of night as many English as were there, and with them doors and shutters bare, with which before the break of day they bridged across the pools, that they might have firm ground whereupon to stand, and that their horse upon dry land might cross, all ready for the fight." Thomas Gray, an English knight who fought at Bannockburn, describes the English position after the defeat of Clifford and Beaumont by Thomas Randolph. Some of whom, the English, fled to the castle, others to the king's army, which, having already left the road through the wood, had debauched upon a plain near the water of Forth, beyond Bannockburn, an evil, deep, wet marsh, where the said English army unharnessed and remained all night, having sadly lost confidence and being too much disaffected by the events of the day. Well, so taken together, these two accounts provide several important clues about the movements of the English army and its baggage train at the close of the first day of battle. Barber tells us that the English bivouacked in the carse. Part of the carse was swampy ground, requiring improvised bridges of rafters, doors and shutters. The crossing continued until just before daybreak. Only after bridging the pools did they reach firm dry ground, and from this dry ground their horses could cross the Bannockburn and be ready for the battle. Gray adds, the king's army and baggage train had already left the road through the wood, the Torwood. It emerged onto the plain, which is the carse, the flat carse, near the River Forth. This was stated as beyond the Bannockburn. But from whose perspective? Were they beyond the Bannockburn from Clifford's perspective, who was already on the north and west side of the burn, or the baggage train, which was on the east and south side of the burn? Now this distinction is crucial. Could it be that Gray, who was captured on the west side of the Bannockburn where Clifford was routed, was describing the English baggage train proceeding along the east bank of the Bannockburn and northwards towards the Great Carriage Road of the Abbot? It seems likely. So they didn't cross at the Orchard Ford, not the baggage train. It would be far too cumbersome for a whole baggage train many miles long to cross at this Orchard Ford, which lay only 200 to 300 yards from some of the woodland at the bottom of the escarpment of Balquidderrock. They would have been sitting ducks. I believe they've continued up the east of the Bannockburn. They proceeded past, continuing on the east side of the Bannockburn over the carse, which we will later confirm was traversable, and on towards the Great Carriage Road. This interpretation is crucial to the outcome of the battle. Further evidence that they passed the orchard comes from the Lanarkos Chronicle. During the rout, he states, another calamity that befell the English was that whereas they had shortly before crossed a great ditch called the Bannockburn, into which the tide flows, and now wanted to recross it. In confusion, many nobles and others fell into it with their horses in the crush. Now the tide does not and never has reached anywhere near the Orchard Ford. Therefore, this has not been the main crossing point of the baggage train onto the carse. Gray describes the area of the Bannockburn before crossing as an evil, deep, wet marsh. The English army remained there overnight, demoralised after a day's fighting. These two independent accounts point towards the same sequence of events. The English army and baggage train had expected to approach Stirling by the southern road and cross the Bannockburn on that line of advance at Milton. Following their failure to force that route during the fighting on the first day, they were compelled to abandon the established approach road altogether. Instead, they appear to have turned further north across the difficult waterlogged carse, negotiating the marshy ground at the bottom of Balquidderock escarpment, out of necessity rather than choice. Only after reaching the drier ground further to the north, associated with the Abbot's Great Carriage Road, which in this area ran east to west, could they make a practicable crossing of the Bannockburn, most plausibly in the Crook Bridge area, before crossing onto the hard field for which the battle proceeded on the following morning. Now remember, we discussed there may be as many as 400 to 600 wagons, probably occupied both sides of the Bannockburn around the Abbot's Great Carriage Road at Crook Bridge. Rather than describing a straightforward march along the recognised southern approach, the chroniclers instead depict an army forced off its intended route, struggling across exceptionally difficult terrain in order to regain firm ground further to the north and reach the crossing of the Bannockburn that enabled it to take up its final position on the hard field before the Battle of Bannockburn the next day. The Abbot's Road over which the English had crossed the Bannockburn was now at their back and left flank, while on the right flank the Abbot's Road took you over the Pell Stream towards Stirling Castle and Cambus Kenneth. This is significant to the outcome of the battle, as we will shortly see. So can we corroborate Barber and Gray's accounts? Well, in August 2022, a paper was published in volume 17 of the Journal of Conflict Archaeology, which looked at the terrain around Stirling at the Battle of Bannockburn 1314. The journal was an environmental reconstruction of Bannockburn in 1314 by leading academics. So the following is a summary of a summary from the 22 Journal of Archaeology. I hope I do it justice. If Edward II and his army descended from the St Ninian's Ridge sometime late on the 23rd of June 1314, as seems likely from the primary sources, what might he have seen and thought? He would have seen the Stirling Carse as wide as it is today, stretching over 3 kilometres between the bottom of the ridge at Balquidderock to the River Forth. The slope he descended was steep and not easy going, in some places poorly drained and boggy. Part of the slope was farmland, as at Greenyards, but others were wooded still, albeit probably grazed at Balquidderock, where soil and topography discouraged woodland clearance. At the foot of the ridge, Edward would have encountered deep and wide peat at the base of the slope, probably everywhere, fed by runoff from the ridge. It extended across the carse for at least several tens of metres. Ahead was the Bannockburn. For some 500 metres, a shallow, gravel-rich stream between low banks. Beyond that, the increasingly incised channel was probably lined and filled with alder and willows, because there was nothing better to be made of it by farming communities. It would have made no sense for Edward not to cross the Bannockburn as soon as he could, before the channel became incised, unless his left flank was menaced from inside the Balquidderock Wood. Now this is an important interpretation on which I differ, as we have already discussed. The north-flowing incised stream of the Coxpow, Bannock and Pellstream burns gave structure to the high carse, allowing the carse to be traversed. By the early 14th century, peat west of the Bannockburn, it is argued, had been cleared from the carse. it was not a problem for Edward to have crossed. Barber's hard field beyond the peat pools needed for Edward to fully use his cavalry may then have existed only beyond the Pelstream burn on the wide strips of lower peat-free carse and the actively forming floodplain of the River Forth, north of an area around Redhall Farm. It is here that provides the best ground for Edward's battle. Well, that's a summary of the summary from the Journal of Archaeology. Very interesting. So what do Barber, Gray and the modern environmental reconstruction academics agree on? Well, modern environmental research of the carse strongly supports what Barber and Gray described 7 centuries ago. Both chroniclers portray the Stirling carse in 1314 as wet, uneven and treacherous in places. And the 2022 scientific reconstruction confirms that this is exactly what the landscape was like. Barber speaks of soldiers laying rafters and doors and shutters across pools to reach firm ground. Gray calls the area an evil deep wet marsh where the English army spent a miserable night. Modern analysis shows the same conditions: boggy slopes, belts of peat at the foot of the St Ninian Ridge, scattered woodland and burns increasingly cutting into deep channels that would be impossible for wagons to cross. All 3 sources agree on the essentials. The English were forced off their intended southern road at Milton. Bruce had denied them entry by restricting their movement. They were forced onto the carse. The carse was waterlogged and difficult in areas, a landscape of peat pools, streams and marsh at the bottom of the escarpment. Movement was slow and exhausting. Wagons bogged down, horses struggled, and some of the army bivouacked in the mire. Only the northern carse offered firm ground. The area of firm ground towards the River Forth was the first place an army could form up on hard ground. In short, the medieval eyewitnesses and modern science tell the same story. Edward II's army had to fight the landscape before it ever fought the Scots. Forced off its planned route, slowed by marsh and peat, and only reaching solid ground after a long night, the English arrived tired, disordered, and badly positioned for the battle that followed. Which brings us to the night before the battle. The summer twilight settled over the carse. 2 very different camps prepared for morning. There was a mixed mood within the English camp. Some young impetuous knights were eager for a battle the next day, while others urged caution. Among the rank and file, many fretted over the defeats from day one, and unease spread throughout the ranks, while others made merry and got drunk. Logistically, wagons needed organising. Supplies had to reach the forward divisions. Officers attempted to bring order to an army that had marched all day and fought several sharp engagements. Behind the scenes, logistics continued. Across the Scottish lines, Bruce addressed his men. Barber tells us they confessed their sins and prepared themselves for whatever the next day might bring. Whether every detail of the speech is authentic matters less than the mood it conveys. The Scots understood what was at stake. The very existence of Scotland depended on the outcome of the next day's battle. They also knew something that some of Edward's commanders were only beginning to realise. The battlefield favoured them. By the evening of the 23rd of June, the English army had entered a trap, and tomorrow it would attempt to fight its way out.